Hi, I'm Beth, creator of dryitcanit.com, and today I want to show you how easy it is to can fresh tomatoes. Now there's three methods to do this. One is what they call a hot pack, and that's basically where you prepare your tomatoes and you heat them up to about simmering for about 5 minutes. And then you can the tomatoes and you can the juice of the tomatoes. You may have added a little bit of liquid, but you put all of that into a hot jar. The second method is a raw pack with a hot liquid. So that's where you take and you prepare your tomatoes and then you put them in your jars and then you add a hot liquid. Hot tomato juice or hot water typically is what's used there. And the third method is completely raw pack with no liquid. And that's the method I'm going to use today. So in other words, the only thing that's going to be going into my jars, besides some salt and some acid, which I'll get to, will be the tomatoes. I don't want my tomatoes watered down, and I know that I use them mostly, at least this batch, for soups and for stews, so this method works for me. Now, the advantages or disadvantages. If you heat your tomatoes ahead of time, you're releasing some of that oxygen, so you're less likely to have a jar that has the liquid or the water at the bottom with your tomatoes floating. If I have some of that, I'm not really too worried about it because that liquid at the bottom is strictly juice, and I know that that's a product that is a natural byproduct of the tomato, and it's going to go in and add flavoring to my dishes, so I'm fine with that. So again, I'm using a raw pack with no hot liquid method today. So the first thing though, regardless of what method you want to use, is you want to prepare your tomatoes. So to prepare your tomatoes, I'm going to demonstrate a few tomatoes just to kind of show you how I do it. But obviously you want to wash your tomatoes really well, check them over for bad spots. If there are bad spots, either put those tomatoes aside and use them for something else, cutting out the bad spots, or make sure that you cut out the bad spots, but make sure that you go deep enough and wide enough that any bad spot, you know, where it might have started to mold or something, is removed. If you have bad product in, you're going to get bad product out. So the first thing I do after washing my tomatoes is I take my raw tomatoes, and I have some of different sizes, and that's fine, but you have your stem end, and then of course you have opposite of the stem end, you have that little bit where your flower was. What I do first thing is I take my knife and I just insert it, and I make just a cross or a little T in there. I don't know, hopefully you can see that. And the reason I do that is because it's really much easier, I think, to get your skins off. Now, many people will can with the skins on. The recommended method is to remove those. I personally prefer them removed, so that's what I go with. Now that said, I also save my skins and I dehydrate them to make tomato powder because it makes a really good tomato powder. So what I've done is I've cut some T's into the bottom of these tomatoes, and I'm going to put them in hot water for 30 to 60 seconds. And I'm actually going to take my boiling pot, bring it over here, put them in so I can show you the process. So I'll be back in just a second. I have my pot of hot water here, which I removed from the stove and put a cover on just to keep it hot. And then I'm simply going to plunge my tomatoes in there for about 30 or 60 seconds. And what that's going to do is really cause the skin to separate a little bit from the tomatoes. I also have a bowl of cold water. Now ice water is better, I just don't have any ice. So I actually had some water in the refrigerator to get nice and cold, and I have another container of water so that I can refill this. So I'm just going to have my tomatoes in here for 30 to 60 seconds, and when I take them out, when I did that little T cut or a cross cut in the bottom of them, that makes it much easier to remove the skin. Now, I like to cut my tomatoes in chunks when I'm putting them in the jars. You can leave them whole, you can leave them in halves, quarters, whatever you want to do. So, now I'm just going to take one of these tomatoes out, put that in the cold water. I'm going to take the smaller ones initially and put those in the cold water. And the other thing I'm going to do as soon as they get cool enough to handle is I'm going to core them. So in other words, I'm going to take the inside core out of the tomato. So here I have one, and I'm going to take the core. That's the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm just going to cut around that core like so. I just use a semicircle and basically have a cone almost and put that on a plate. Then on the back side where I have the tea, I'm able basically to take my knife, grab hold of that, and just pull that skin off. And this works really, really well. Now, sometimes, and I probably, because I'm not on a pot of boiling water and I took it off the stove, usually these quarters come off pretty much just like the whole quarter. So, you know, in bigger pieces like this. Now again, you can throw the skins away, that's not a problem, but if you dehydrate it all, these are amazing. So now when I have a tomato here where all the skin is removed, and I'm simply going to take my skins and put them over here, again because I'm going to dehydrate them. I could put them whole in my jar, I could quarter them, I could half them. I'm going to do mine in chunks for a couple of reasons. Because I'm putting these in the can, and because you're going to push these down into the can, you're going to want to tighten that up as much as you can. In other words, you want to squish those down so that they're juicy and you don't have a lot of air. So let's take another tomato out of here. Again, it was in the hot water for 30 to 60 seconds. Then I plunged it into cold water. I take a knife at about a 45-degree angle to cut out my stem. I end up with a piece that's a little bit like a cone. And then I turn it upside down where I have my cross, and I just grab those skins and pull them off. And this works really well. Now, it's a little bit tedious doing tomatoes, but it's really, really, really easy. Because once I have all my tomatoes prepped, then I'm going to go ahead and get them in the can, and I'll talk about acidification. Basically, your foods have to cook a certain amount of time, or they have to have a certain amount of acid in them. And tomatoes are sort of right on the edge. In other words, their pH is right around that 4.6 or that 4.5 number. When the USDA tested these, they found that because it was on the edge, they didn't want to have you cook them longer than needed to be, but at the same point in time, you wanted to make sure that you had enough acid in these so that you can control any problems with potentially botulism down the road. So anytime you're going to do tomatoes, whether you're doing any of the three methods that I talked about, you definitely want to make sure that you're going to add an acid to each of your jars. And I will talk about that when I get ready to jar these up. Now, the other thing that you want to do is you want to decide whether or not you want to put salt in your jars. Again, that is completely optional, and that's one of the things that I like about canning the most, is you can add whatever it is that you want to your jars. I'm not going to talk today about adding onions or peppers or anything else to your jars when you're canning tomatoes. I think that's a lesson for another day. But certainly that's another choice you have, but your preparation is going to be different. So again, you can see how easy it is to take these skins off. It is a little time consuming. They do come off a little bit easier when I actually have the hot water on the stove. So, but you get a good feel for what this is. So go ahead and prep all your tomatoes. Again, leave them whole, half, quarters, whatever you want to do. I'm going to finish prepping all of my tomatoes. I'm going to pressure can 4 quarts of these today. And when I have my tomatoes prepped, I'm going to be back and I'll talk about the next steps. So here are my next tricks. Because I know I'm going to can 4 quarts, I put my chopped tomatoes in a 1-gallon ice cream bucket. I know this will give me 4 quarts or 8 pints, whatever I'm going for. And while this looks 3/4 full, and I could can them this way, you have to put them in your jar and you have to really push them down to squeeze and try and get rid of the air. So my secret is to take an immersion blender. This one is actually a potato masher. It does really nice mashed potatoes. And I just give this a light breaking up, so to speak. You want to be careful because you don't want to introduce a lot of air. But let me show you what the difference is so you can see what I have here. And I'm just going to go down to the bottom a couple of times just to break this up a little bit and to juice them, because that juice will help get rid of that extra air too. So I have a little bit less, it looks like, but what I have now is a more watery version. I don't know if I can turn that without spilling it. So basically my tomatoes, so to speak, are immersed in a liquid, but it's the liquid from the tomatoes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep filling my tomatoes here until I get almost a full gallon here, because I know that will fill my full quarts. And of course I'm collecting my tomato skins because I'm going to dehydrate those afterwards and make tomato powder, which is an amazing ingredient to have in your kitchen. So stay tuned as we move forward. All right, I already have a couple quarts jarred up and ready to go, but let me show you where we're at here. So you can see I have my tomatoes, and I used an immersion blender just to kind of break them up a little bit, but the juice is right up to the top. That said, the tomatoes are still really chunky, which is what I want, but this helps me get a good pack, so to speak, into the jar. So I want to talk about acidification. Anytime you're canning tomatoes, whether you're pressure canning them or whether you put them in a water bath, you need to add acid. And that's because the pH of tomatoes is right on the borderline of being an acid food or not being an acid food. Whereas fruits have a pH that's lower than the 4.6 typically, so that is considered an acidic food. So with tomatoes, you need to add an acid, and it can be lemon juice or it can be something called citric acid, which is what I use because it's easy to use. When I buy my citric acid, I always check the bottom or the side of the jar to see what the expiration date is. And then as a little tip, I write the expiration date right on the top so that I don't start canning and then forget to check and see if my expiration date is good. But canning the tomatoes is pretty simple. You basically are going to prepare your jars according to your manufacturer directions, depending upon the kind of canner you're using. And you're going to add your acid. Now, again, you can use lemon juice or you can add the citric acid, which is what I choose to use. If you're using lemon juice, you're going to want to add 1 tablespoon per pint or 2 tablespoons per quart. I'm using the citric acid, so I want to use a 1/4 teaspoon for a pint or a 1/2 teaspoon for a quart, which is what I'm doing, so I'm going to add a 1/2 teaspoon. Salt is entirely optional. It's up to you if you want to put salt in your tomatoes or if you don't want to put salt in your tomatoes. I choose to do that, so I'm going to add my salt. Now, sometimes people will say you need to add canning salt. You can't use salt with iodine. The reality is you can, but your product might be a little bit cloudy. It's just a look thing, and if you're going to add other things later, it probably doesn't make a difference. I use kosher salt, and the general rule of thumb for salt is to add a 1/2 teaspoon per pint or 1 teaspoon per quart. I'm using my 1/2 teaspoon measurer, so I've got that in there. So I've got my acid in here, and I've got my salt. That's hot. And what I want to do with each of my jars is I want to fill them to a 1/2 inch of headspace. So I'm simply going to add my tomatoes along with the juice. I find a soup ladle works really well because you get a good mix of that tomato and that juice. And you just want to fill that up till you have your 1/2 inch of headspace. When you're using a funnel, that typically means it's going to come up into the funnel, and then when you pull it out, it's going to drop down, and I need just a little bit more. Your 1/2 inch mark is typically going to be halfway between this bottom ridge and the top lid. So that's where I want to be, and I'm only at the 1 inch mark here, so I know that I want to add just a little bit more. So only a 1/2 inch headspace needed for tomatoes. Now, that said, I also want to debubble. And again, I've already added my acid and I've already added my salt. You can add that on the top if you want instead of the bottom. Doesn't make any difference. Then debubble, even though I've got mostly liquid in here, it's still good to do this. Generally, you want to use a non-metallic tool for that. Use plastic, use a spatula. I use the back of a wooden spoon. I wouldn't use a straw because that's got air in it, and you could introduce air in here. And air, remember, can interfere with the bringing up of the temperature for your tomatoes. Then I'm going to dip a clean cloth again in vinegar. Sometimes I'll use vinegar, sometimes I'll use plain water. Plain water is fine. Vinegar is not going to hurt the tomato at all, which is why I choose to use that. Some people will use vinegar for their acid. I'm not sure of the amounts to use for that. I think it's the same as lemon juice, but don't quote me on that. That said, I need to grab some lids here. The other thing is sometimes I tried lemon juice once and I didn't care for it because it had too much of a lemony flavor for the tomatoes. Some people will taste that in the citric acid. If you want to add a little bit of sugar to offset that, you certainly can. I would say use the same amount of sugar that you're using of your citric acid or of your lemon juice. So again, you're just going to take your lid. Remember, lids the new lids anyway, do not have to be preheated or boiled. Check the back of your box because the compound has changed. And a lot of us still have, you know, some of the lids from the last year or two on hand. So put your lid on, center it, take your screw band, put that on. Try and get it on straight right away here. Of course, when you're on TV, here we go. So, and then just finger tight and then into the canner. And then I'm going to pull that last jar out like so. And again, preheated all of the jars. You're working with hot jars and you want to keep them hot when you're working with them. In terms of how long you're going to can this, it really depends on the type of canner that you have. Hang on just a minute because I want to make sure that I get my citric acid in here, and I want to make sure that I get my salt in here, like so. It really depends on the type of canner you have in terms of how long you're going to can it. This last one I should spoon it in. There's really three kinds of canners nowadays. You have a stovetop canner, and that might have a weighted a weight on it, or it might have a dial on it. And both of those are going to can on different amounts of time. I use an electric canner, and that again can be a different amount of time. So instead of me telling you today how long you should can your product, and you can water bath this if you choose to. I can't water bath in my canner because my canner does not accommodate quarts in a water bath. But depending upon how long you want to, or depending upon what your equipment is, will determine the amount of time that you're going to can this. So I'm going to say check your directions on your canner, and that will tell you. And then you're also going to adjust for altitude if needed. Now I have an electric Presto pressure canner. Love it. Like it because A, I have a glass top stove and I don't quite trust that, and B, it's just too heavy to lift the canner all the time. So mine is 25 minutes where I'm at, but that's the directions for my electric canner. Your canner, your stovetop canner, whether it's a dial or whether it's a weighted, whether it has a weight on it, is going to make a difference in terms of how long you're going to can tomatoes. So do check your directions for that. So I'm going to get the lid on this. I'm going to get the rim on this, the screw band, and then I'm going to go ahead and put this in my pressure canner. I'm going to can it for me for 25 minutes, but again, please check your canner. And then when it's all done, I'll be back to show you the end result. My tomatoes have sat overnight and they all sealed. You know your jars are sealed when you push on the cover and they don't give it all. So my next steps are going to be to wash this up to remove the sticky residue, date them, and get them down into the pantry. Remember to store your food in a dark place and in relatively stable temperatures. Dark doesn't mean it has to be pitch black, but basically keep it out of direct sunlight. Now, one thing about tomatoes is sometimes you'll get some settling. So if you look carefully at this, for example, you'll see a little bit of water up on top. Oftentimes you're going to have your tomatoes float and you're going to have some water at the bottom. That's really an aesthetic thing. It happens when you cut your tomatoes. It changes the enzymes and the pectins, and I can't give you any more scientific thing than that. So sometimes they can and they look beautiful. Sometimes they can and they have water, kind of a reddish liquid at the bottom. Perfectly good, not a problem. They're sealed. The other thing you'll notice is that all of mine actually reduced in volume. I put the headspace up to a 1/2 inch. Again, it's not a problem. Think about when you cook cabbage, it cooks down, and that's really essentially what happened here. The important thing is that you added your acid, that you canned it for the proper amount of time for the canner that you're using, and that it's sealed. So if you learned something today or found this valuable, if you give me a thumbs up, that helps me know what kind of videos you like to watch. I'd love if you'd subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, thanks for watching and happy canning.